Thank you very much indeed, Simon. It's lovely to be here in Sydney. I've only been here once before. I'm delighted to be here. And it's an extremely extraordinary city. You should be very, very proud of it. Simon and I were just chatting away, and he was saying, no, you're a leading Irish economist. And we were chatting about that. And then about half an hour ago, we went around to get a coffee because I'm a wee bit jet-lagged. And he saw what happens to a leading Irish economist when he puts his credit card in an ATM machine. It got rejected. So there's a significant reflection on our credit rating as a society and the rating of economists in our society. But no, I want to talk this evening about 2 or 3 big trends that I see in the world economy. The first thing I want to talk about is what I call the Malthusian moment. Now, the Malthusian moment is when the population of the world gets too big and it cannot support itself food-wise. Now, this is something that we don't really hear about because Malthus, of course, was an English economist, 19th century dude. He said that what's going to happen is we're going to have far too many people, we'll run out of food, and we'll have famine and pestilence. And what actually happened? The opposite. But that's not to say he was wrong all the time. So I want to talk a wee bit about this Malthusian moment. And the other thing I want to make or reinforce is the idea that food abundance is relatively new. And food security is an absolutely crucial part of humanity. Ever since a dude called Joseph rocked up in Egypt and had a word in the Pharaoh's shell and said, if I were you, I'd put some of that corn that you've just harvested into a warehouse because your 7 years of plenty may well be followed by 7 years of famine. Food security has always been part of human behavior. I mean, for example, how many people here's mother, like my mother, spent all her time saying to me as a child, eat up everything on the plate. Why? Because she had, and I'm sure loads of people's mothers here were the same, because she had a memory of scarcity. She had a memory of a time when food wasn't available. And that is not that long ago. So, for example, if you go to certain parts of China, when they say, hello, how are you? They don't say, hello, how are you to each other. They say, hello, have you eaten? Why? Because of, again, the memory of famine. So all these things are reasonably recent in human history. Now, economists don't like talking about this stuff because they're prepared to talk about GDP and inflation, etc. But what actually binds everything together is the umbilical cord of the global food supply. And I think I want to reinforce this again and again this evening. Now, the other thing about economists is they tend to be dry. They tend, I always believed, to use jargon and language that people can't understand in order to elevate themselves from the rest of you. A wee bit like priests used to do years ago, speak in Latin to the congregation. And in order to actually combat that, we in Dublin have come up with this notion of punk economics. It comes from our appreciation of punk rock, which again, when I was a child, I was terrorized by the tyranny of my older sister's brutal record collection. Steely Dan in particular, which as a young fella is a brutal thing. And then emerging out of nowhere became the Sex Pistols, which changed our world. And I think economics has become similarly overblown and a wee bit like Steely Dan and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. So the idea here now is to rip economics away from self-indulgence and to look at it in a different way. And so we've brought over from Ireland a little animation in order to help us do this. So play it away there.
Run, ever, run, ever, run, run, run. Run for your life, the boy carries a gun. When tick, tick, boom. When tick, tick, boom. When tick, tick, boom. When tick, 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 boom. Run, ever, run, ever, run, run, run. Run for your life, the boy carries a gun.
What have the following Aussies all got in common? Ned Kelly, Kevin Rudd, Paul Keating, Peter Carey, Kylie Minogue, Errol Flynn, Russell Crowe, Jason Donovan, Tom Kennelly, Susie O'Neill, James O'Connor and Paul Hogan. The hint is in their names. What binds them together is food, or rather the lack of it. These Irish Australians are the result of a terrifying Malthusian warning to the world, the Great Irish Famine. There can be fewer, more vicious ecological examples of what happens when a population gets too big to support itself than what happened to my own country years and years ago. This experience killed millions and scattered the Irish tribe all over the world, many of whom are in the audience tonight. Quite apart from destroying your good-looking genes, keeping you up at night and generally lowering the tone of your neighbourhood, the Great Irish Exodus tells us what happens when hungry people panic. They move to better parts of the world en masse. And this could be the story of the entire globe in the next 50 years. Unless we solve the issue of food security, the world is facing a Malthusian nightmare on a catastrophic scale. As the rock of the insatiable demand of 7 billion, soon to be 10 billion people, smashes into the hard place of the planet's limited resources to produce that one thing which keeps us all alive, food. And when you drill down, the food dilemma is actually a bigger dilemma. It is an energy problem, and one which is not going away. So that's the downside. The upside is that Malthus's central 19th century prediction that too many people would eventually run out of food has rarely occurred anywhere at any time. We have been a sufficiently ingenious animal in most cases, and when faced with existential challenges, humanity has come up with the technology to increase yields, increase farming productivity, increase supply, and avoid catastrophe. In fact, so successful has this been that the problem for many parts of the rich world is not too little food, but too much food. It's not too many skinny people, but too many fat people. And it's not a medical system which is combating the challenges of malnutrition, but one that is struggling with the challenges of obesity. So let's stand back and look at the big picture. The world's population is moving from 7 billion today to 10 billion in 2050. But this is not really the big issue. The big issue is consumption. It would be okay if we all consumed like Kenyans, but we don't. The Earth's resources are enough to sustain only about 2 billion people at the European standard of living, because on average, Europeans, like the average Australian, consumes far more resources than any of the poorest 2 billion people in the world. However, Europeans and Aussies use only about half of the resources of the average American. If all the world's 7 billion people consumed as much as the average American, it would take the resources of over 5 planet Earths to sustainably support all of us. So either we eat less to allow them eat more, or we are stuck. And it's not just how much people eat, but what they eat. We all know, or at least we do as economists know, that the first habit to change when people get rich is their diet. Here's an example. Of all the many odd jobs I've done over the years, one of the strangest by far was a stint as a red-haired Irish barman in a Chinese restaurant in Toronto, Canada in the mid-1980s. My quite straightforward Chinese colleague told me straight to my face that I smelled horrible. "You stink horribly of milk," he groaned, and then went on to tell me that Chinese people don't eat dairy and could smell dairy coming out of our pores. Nice. Now, years later, when I first visited Shanghai, what struck me wasn't the skyscrapers and the development, but the amount of Starbucks, which we all know isn't really coffee at all, but flavoured milk. So what had happened? In the 1980s, the Chinese didn't eat dairy, but by 2010, they were necking down pints of milk. What happened was they had got rich. And once they got rich, the Chinese middle class wanted to be like the Western middle class. In fact, as an aside, looking at the amount of yoga, Reiki and Tai Chi outfits here in Sydney, it looks as if not only do the Chinese middle class want to be Western, but the Western middle class want to be Chinese. But that's a different story. Now, the change in diet of the Chinese and Indian and Brazilian populations is one of the biggest undocumented stories of globalization. It is driving up food prices dramatically, which are punishing the poorest people in these countries and all over the world, and prompting unforeseen political developments that seem initially unrelated, but are all tied together by the umbilical cord of the global food supply. For example, while much has been made of the yearning for democracy behind the Arab Spring, few of us focus on the destabilising impact of a 50% increase in the price of wheat in the past few years, which prompted food riots in Egypt, which in turn fueled the political change. Food is politics, and politics is food. And we shouldn't forget this as we move forward, because the price of food is rising, and this will continue to do so. As the world's diet changes, we want to consume more and more meat and dairy. But moving from rice to meat is an enormous production challenge. The UN estimates that the global demand for meat will double over the next 20 years. Now, this presents an enormous energy challenge, because producing a kilo of meat takes 10 kilos of fertilizer, 30 litres of oil, creates 4 tons of greenhouse gas, and uses between 15,000 and 70,000 litres of water in a world where by 2050, 1/3 of the globe's population is going to face water shortages. And it's not just water, because all this increased food production depends on the one thing that the world is running out of: oil. The fertilizers, pesticides and transport to grow and move this food around depends on huge amounts of petrochemicals. In short, we are eating fossil fuels. And quite apart from demand, the single biggest driver of the price of food is the price of oil. So we know that we're hitting peak oil, but might we also be hitting peak food? And if so, what's next? One final bit of the equation is gambling. This is where the frothy response to the global financial crisis mixes with the fundamental trajectory of food prices. All around the world, central banks in the US, in Europe, and in China are printing money as if it's going out of fashion. And all this money has to go somewhere. Now, the central bankers are hoping that it will go into your pocket and you will spend it, and by spending it, you will increase the demand for stuff that I produce, and then I will produce more, earn more, and buy the stuff that you produce, and in the process, we will all be better off. But that presupposes that the banks will lend money to me and that I will want to borrow money from them. But what if I have too much debt already and I don't want to borrow, and the banks have too much bad debt and they don't want to lend? In this case, the tsunami of cheap money has to go somewhere. And guess what food is in the great financial casino called the financial markets? It is a commodity to be gambled on. So the process of bailing out credit junkies in the rich world is driving up the price of survival for billions of people in the poor world. And the more money we print, the higher the price of food. Because ultimately, printing money is nothing more than robbing for consumption today from the resources of tomorrow. The impact of all of this is playing out unevenly here in the West, where food is gradually becoming a class issue. The poor are getting fatter, and the rich are getting thinner. In fact, sometimes it feels as though the richer you are, the more you know about food, the more you talk about food, the more you eulogize about recipes, but the less you eat. The major problem with this diet divide is that the major food producing companies globally want to produce more and more food to satisfy the insatiable demands of their shareholders. And this is then being made, in the West at least, into cheaper and cheaper portions, bigger and bigger portions, and more sugary, easily digestible packages, driving up waste sizes and down quality. As this obesity epidemic becomes more and more widespread, the health of the nation plummets and the health cost of the nation rises. Is it any wonder that the fastest growing health budget in the West is the exploding cost of diabetes-related illness and complications? This, ladies and gentlemen, is where the food challenge of the next 30 years is taking us. It is a roller coaster where finance and ecology meets economics, demography and politics, and where the outcome is not just about the price or the quality of the food in our shops or at our tables, but the very survival and progression of humanity. In a world where billions of people want what you have and might be prepared to do anything, politically, militarily or financially, to achieve this. Kitchens in Ireland, they're enormous. Kitchens are about the size of this room. And they've enormous fridges. You can look at them. I don't know about you, but I don't know what goes on in a walk-in fridge. But anyway, and of course, the interesting thing about the people, they look as if they haven't eaten for about 4 or 5 months. But that's just the way it goes about food and that carry on. Now, I want to talk about, to digest that, about 2 specific topics. Go back to the Chinese lad when I was working as a, you know, what happens in Ireland is we get thrown out of the country very early in our lives, and we end up doing bizarre jobs. A lot of us here in Sydney in the last couple of years, but obviously a lot of us here for the last 100 or 200 odd years. Working in Canada as a barman in a Chinese restaurant and being told that you stank, and being in a minority of 1 in the Chinese restaurant. So you couldn't really hit back in any way. But it's something that really stuck with me. The idea that this was a huge, huge race, the Chinese, that didn't, out of choice, eat dairy. And then to go to China and see the monumental transformation in their diet, and to see that this is happening all over the world as people get richer. And the other thing that struck me was when I was a kid in Dublin a few years before going to Canada, we were in this sort of middle-class school. We had a little blazer, which you might as well have had a target going through working-class areas on your back, right? And my abiding memory of a teenager is running away from skinny lads, right? Now, when I take my son to play soccer in the same areas now, I see the sons of those same scrawny lads are enormous. So there are 2 dramatic and totally counterintuitive challenges presented towards us. The one challenge is, how do we produce more food in order to avoid a Malthusian moment? How do we produce more food? The second challenge is, how do we consume less food in order to avoid an obesity epidemic in the West? Now, these are both operating at the same time. Very, very difficult to imagine how we're going to get out of this. Because more food and the challenge to produce more food is a challenge of scarcity, it's a challenge of resources, it's a challenge of constraints. Consuming less food is the challenge of abundance, it's the challenge of behavior, and it's the challenge of not constraint, but restraint. So one is a behavioral problem that we need to change in our countries, and the other one is a production problem that we need to be part of the solution. Because when you think about it, this crisis, like all crises, is something that comes upon you quite quickly. Now, years ago, another odd job of mine was I worked for a fellow called Jack Welch, who was the head of General Electric. And my job was to make him look good in a book tour. I was the MC. And we actually got talking over a year. And again, he was from the tribe, like Clover here, from the great Irish tribe, you know. Her name is Collins, really, deep down. And she was educated at the Loretto, where my mother was a teacher, so I feel bonded to her already. But Jack Welch and I were talking, remember he talked to me about crisis, and he said, if the crisis is in your family, or in your love life, or in your social life, or whatever, it's important to do 3 things. The first thing you've got to do is define reality, not as you would like the world to be, but as it is. The second thing you've got to do is do something about it. Don't talk about it, do something about it. And the third thing in a crisis is face into the crisis. And once you face into the crisis, having been prepared, the crisis is usually solvable. Now that we have to keep in the back of our minds, because defining reality, as far as I can see, is twofold. One is the prospect of a Malthusian moment where the world can't feed itself. And I believe that is the logical conclusion of the irresistible force of 10 billion consumers. And I say consumers, not citizens, because we have told them to be consumers, not citizens. We've told them to be consumers. So the irresistible force of this 10 billion consumers smashing into the reality of finite resources. And that can only end, unless we do something about it, in two echoes from history. The first is the Great Irish Famine, where people realize very, very quickly that the supply chain has broken in terms of food, and they leave the country in huge, huge numbers, which is what happened in Ireland. We're the only European country to have suffered this. It's deep in our memory, and it's deep in our collective psyche. And that could happen again in much bigger countries. And of course, the second thing politically is the Arab Spring. If you cause people to panic over food because your supply chain breaks, they revolt. This is simple political reality. And if you think about the country we're talking about China. We're not talking about Egypt, we're talking about China. So these are two enormous, enormous dilemmas. Now, all the time when I listen to the UN guys, they say, oh, but don't worry, we've got a plan. And I'm minded to repeat the great wisdom of that fantastic American economist, Mike Tyson. And he said, everybody has a plan until you get a punch in the face. It's very wise, very wise. Now, Mike Tyson, we'll park him there, okay? But he's my touchstone for economic knowledge. Now, what sort of punch in the face could you get? Think about it. Where could the punches come from in food supply? They could come from peak oil. We know we are not so much at the end of oil, we're at the end of cheap oil. And cheap oil is what drove the Green Revolution in the 1970s, when all the people who said there was going to be a Malthusian moment were defeated by the fact that oil prices stayed low and fertilizers were used, which are used from petrochemicals. It could come from there. It could come from water. We saw, and Clover mentioned it as well, that water is a scarce resource. You know that, being in Australia. If you live in Ireland, you don't really know that, because we swim most of the time. We kind of paddle around to school as kids, okay? And the third place I believe it could come from is financial markets. And this is something that has always intrigued me, the role of financial markets in what is going on. All around the world, I know Australia hasn't been that affected by the global financial crisis yet. And it may well be in the future. But what has happened is, because the central banks print money, the money goes out into the normal banks. The normal banks then, in normal times, if their balance sheets aren't broken, they lend it to us. And then we spend and we get the whole thing going again. But what is happening now is the banks, A, don't want to lend to us, and B, the citizens of Britain and America, to a lesser degree Canada, are not borrowing. Why? Because we've too much debt, inherited from a property boom, which I know you're experiencing something quite similar here. So where does the money go? The money goes to hedge funds. And what do the hedge funds do? They speculate on commodities. And what is a commodity? Food. So not only the richest 1%, the richest 1% of the 1% are driving up the price of basic food for billions of people, the 90% who have nothing. Now, this is what is happening all around the world. And this is why financial markets need to be tamed in order to have a logical and humane food discussion. Now, somebody very, very clever once said, I'm not too sure whether it was Albert Einstein or David Campesi, that the definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This is what we're doing with respect to food. We're just doing the same thing we've always done. And if we've got to solve the problem, to avoid a Malthusian moment, it demands enormous political courage, enormous political vision, and the major countries of the world, the major food suppliers Australia being one, the European Community, Argentina, Canada and America, come together with the major potential food importers, and I'm talking about China and India, to come up with a plan for the next 20 years. I realize that this sounds remote because there's such an absence of geopolitical cooperation. But over the course of the next few years, Malthusian moments around the world will prompt that. And I believe Australia will have a role to play, a very significant role to play. That's on the production side. What about on the consumption side? What about the idea of changing people's behavior? What about the idea of saying to people who are threatened with or whose family are obese that we can change our behavior? Now, think about over the last 20 years. When I was a kid, and I'm sure it's the same with you, nobody wore seatbelts in Ireland. Nobody. It was like a lottery. Okay, I remember going down to Cork in a Mini with my mum and my dad, my two sisters and a dog, right? Hooring along. And now my kids won't get into a car unless everybody's belted up. Why? Because of public information campaigns. Also think about smoking. When I was a kid, everyone in Ireland smoked. Chain smoked. Now very few people chain smoke. Why? Public information campaigns and active penalising of cigarette companies. All of which has dramatically reduced lung cancer in our country and all over Western Europe. So I believe that we can change people's eating behaviour and habits quite easily because people, if they're given the right incentives and the right information, will ultimately look after themselves. So I think it is possible and it is probable that obesity can be A, stabilized in terms of the growth all over the population, and B, can be reduced in the same way as smoking was reduced. Because ultimately, if you impress upon people that they need to change their behavior, and if you make certain things expensive, as we have done with cigarettes, for example, and if you ban advertising of fast and fatty food products, it will change the way people behave in the same way as seatbelts changed. I believe, for example, in Australia, you changed the way you deal with the sun. That 20 or 30 years ago, people didn't wear sun protection. People who looked like me. Believe me, I'm not born for this place, right? None of my cousins are born to live in a country like this. But you change your behavior. So people do change. Behavior does change. So we have these twin challenges, ladies and gentlemen, and I really do think they are both solvable. The first one is the production. How do we avoid China in particular having a Malthusian moment, which would be catastrophic politically and socially, not just for this part of the world, but everywhere? How do we do that? We sit down and we discuss the future with ourselves and with them, and it can be done. How do we change the behavior of our own fellow citizens whose health is deteriorating because they are consuming cheap, nasty food? We do it in the same way as we change behavior about cigarettes. It can be all done with incentives and public policy and politicians realizing that the politics of behavior are as important as any other type of politics. But in order to do this, I come back to the central point, which is define reality, do something about it. Have we defined reality? Have we done something about it? I'm not too sure we have, but we could start here. Thank you very much.